I'm gonna go ahead and pull up our PowerPoint, but it's totally up to you what you want to talk about, what questions you have, other things you want to do with it. And also like the way that things are set up, you've got your mics on mute, but anytime you just want to interject, just unmute yourselves and just start talking. It's not a problem at all. Just that makes it a lot easier um for me to kind of know what you want to talk about. So eventually at some point I'm gonna want to do a way of talking about or comparing um Augustine and Machiavelli because full disclosure, that's what my dissertation was on. My dissertation was on Machiavelli and Augustine, and it was comparing, well, actually, it was mostly comparing the City of God and another text that Machiavelli wrote all about Rome. But I had to do a lot with Prince too. And so this is kind of like my jam, that comparison. Um, But also because you guys, you've done so well in the class. You're doing so well at kind of seeing the themes as they connect. So if we're talking about this in a connective way, at some point, I'll need to hook up Augustine and Machiavelli more strongly. Um, so I'll do that, but I'll just give a little preview kind of um, how I see them working together and working for the class. Uh, and if you're just joining us, you missed not very much at all. Just my encouragement to say, whenever you want to speak up, go ahead and just interject. And that I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about how I see Augustine and Machiavelli related to each other because that was my dissertation, that was my research. But I won't talk about that as much today as I will in the long run. The big picture things to know about that are that Augustine and Machiavelli are what I think of as two hinge points. So Augustine is writing when we're getting ready to move out of like what's called late antiquity or early Christianity. So he's leaving the ancient world and getting ready to get into the medieval, right? That's kind of the point he's at. Now, Machiavelli is at a similar point. Machiavelli is getting, he's kind of in that big Renaissance energy that's happening, but he still has leftovers in his world from the medieval period. So they're both two people who are in two worlds. And that's what's really interesting about them to me. They inhabit two different worldviews or maybe a transitional phase. And so they have to kind of think about their thoughts in a kind of way. I don't know how many of you would be exposed to the idea of double consciousness, but double consciousness is an idea that comes out of American political thought and specifically out of African American political thought. And it's this idea that you have a consciousness of the world that is kind of your primary experience of it. And then you have an idea of the world that is like a lens or like some glasses you put on that helps you to kind of put on the glasses of the consciousness of the other people in the world you inhabit. So it's called double consciousness because you have your experience and then you have the mediation of your experience through how other people are experiencing the world. And there's a lot of translation work that can happen in that, a lot of ways of kind of, having your own thoughts and then having to ask, okay, well, how would I explain this to someone who thinks differently than me? Or how would I explain this to someone who doesn't think the same things I do? Oh, that's my dog in the background. Um, and both Machiavelli and Augustine have a bit of that. Um, you'll see that as we keep going. So let me go ahead and pull up to PowerPoint. And again, interject, stop at any time. It is so good to have you here. Thank you for being so flexible. Okay, so this is our PowerPoint. That's Machiavelli, and super interesting guy because so he grew up, there's some thought that he's not illegitimate, but there's some thought that his father was. And that of course is going to impact him in different ways. Um, he's exceptionally well-read and very learned, but he's not noble, right? He doesn't have noble blood in any meaningful sense. And he also doesn't have a lot of money, but he is someone who kind of, at the back of the book that I gave you the PDF scan of, the translation, there's letters where he talks about how he spends his day. And he says, he comes home in the evening and he talks to Cicero and he talks to da da da. Like, it's really corny, but you kind of get the picture that he really lives with the figures in his books. Another interesting thing about him that's relevant to our study is that he was tortured. So, just to give you like a quick and dirty rundown of this period in history, um, there's a lot of transition in the way that, we talked about how he's what I'd call a pivot point or a hinge character, like Augustine is. Oh, my dog is saying that she has to go potty. Hold on one second. I'm just going to put her. Okay. But like Augustine too, he has a really kind of wild political moment like he's inhabiting. So Augustine is inhabiting a time where the Roman Empire is dying. And that's something we didn't really get to talk about how mind-blowing that is for people. Like, think about if the concept of America as an empire just died overnight. It would be hard for us. Even if we were maybe sympathetic to that, because it would be such a strong, big change. Well, for Rome to fall, that's something that nobody saw coming. I mean, Rome built aqueducts that are still there, that still work. We don't know how they made concrete. We can't make concrete like they did. Their sort of like staying power seemed, you know, they were just going to go on forever. And for Machiavelli, his sort of political struggle is that they're living in a moment where the princes of Italy are all fighting, right? They're basically oligarchs of different kinds, and they have these private soldiers that fight. There's a lot of civil unrest, and then on top of that, he's lived through basically what is one of the first attempts in that area of the world in that period of history to have a republic. So to get rid of aristocratic forms and to have a republic, and that republic was led by this monk named Savonarola, who you learn about from this. And Savonarola, he is he is like he's not just trying to get Republican government, small R Republican government, meaning like government that's representative of the people. He says that he's getting messages from God, and those messages from God are telling him to overthrow the government, and that God is angry with the nobles and wants to punish them, and that the society is in decay, right? And he'll predict things happening that seem crazy, like that a foreign prince is going to invade. And then it happens. And so all of a sudden, uh, he has a lot more street cred. In the end, he's killed um, by the church, but what he was able to do, what Savonarola was able to do in a very small amount of time, is an example of another one of these political moments where people living through those moments are like, wow, I can't believe this is happening. This is astonishing. This is something I never thought I'd see. Um, and because he lived in a time of so much uh trouble and turmoil, it's not going to surprise you that he ends up kind of falling on the wrong side of it. He gets accused of being a part of a conspiracy to overthrow the government. The best of our ability, it doesn't seem like he was actually involved with it. He was working on diplomatic missions at the time for Florence, but he doesn't seem to be involved in that conspiracy. However, he's tortured. Um, and then he's sent into exile. And I think it's hard probably to overestimate the impact that that has on how he thinks of the world and thinks of himself. Well, he writes The Prince. All of that is to say that he writes The Prince during that exile. Okay, so he he's trying to get back in favor. Uh the Medici are ascendant again, and he's trying to say to this very noble, powerful family that's also a banking family, hey, let me back into your circles. Because, if you read his private correspondence, he hates being in exile. He hates being away from what he considers to be the purpose of life, which is politics. And that's why in the dedicatory letter that I read on YouTube, if you listen to that, he says some really important stuff like, I am giving you the most important thing that I have to give you, which is my knowledge. Because when a new prince comes, people give him what is most valuable, or what would be most valuable to the prince. And this is what I have to do for that. And he says something really cool, which is he describes how someone that's a landscape painter, they have to go into the valleys to paint the mountains or hills. And they have to go onto the mountains or the hills to paint, um, wait, yeah, okay. Yeah, into the valley, paint mountains and hills. Onto the mountains and hills to paint the valley. And together, that's how you get a landscape. And he says, I'm like the landscape painter. I am someone who's been at the height, like in the big leagues of politics. And I've also been on the low, like I'm of low birth, and I know people of low birth, and I've also been like in exile. So I can move back and forth between these worlds. And with that, I can make this picture, like this big portrait for you of everything that's going on. Now, in the book didn't seem to make that much of a difference. So there's that, right? But it became like a huge part of how we live our lives. And there's even like YouTubers and stuff now, like kind of like they're like a like a version of pickup artists or something who will make like Machiavelli's seven laws of power, and they'll just take his info and like try to use it for talking about how to pick up chicks or make money. My point is he's got a lot of staying power. He wrote something the prince probably just threw away, but it's become a pretty big deal. Okay. The first half of the book is all about the types of states that exist in the world and how to get them and how to keep them. Because he's really clear that power is not just about acquisition. Everybody wants to acquire, he says. That's normal. But what happens is a lot of people don't think past that and they don't know how to maintain what they've got. And so he's saying, I can tell you all the different kinds of regimes there are, and then I can tell you how to keep them, like how to keep your power there. Um, Now here he has already signaling something to you that you may not pick up on because why would you pick up on it? At the time, though, people reading it would have been like, oh, wow, what's going on here? He says there's only two types of governments. There's republics and principalities. And republics, remember, are representative forms of government that represent the many. Principalities are like led by one and led by the nobility. Now, this is why it's crazy. Let me pull it up on my phone. This is a major uh departure. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Yeah, it looks like I can. This is a huge departure because there's actually sort of universal agreement on how many government types there are, and what those government types are. And he is ignoring them. Um, I'm gonna switch what I'm sharing here for you. Do, 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 do. All right, here we go. I don't know if you can see this here, but basic forms of government from Aristotle. Um, this is like the ABCs. This is the alphabet of the politics of their time. And one thing to notice about it is that there's more than two kinds of government. First of all, there's six kinds. So when Machiavelli says there's two kinds of government, he's very consciously changing that. Um, Here, the classical teaching that is still kind of the ascendant teaching at the time is there's six kinds. Okay, another thing to notice is that how do we divide these six kinds? You divide them in two ways by looking for two properties. The first is you look at the number of rulers. You can have one ruler, you can have few rulers, you can have many rulers. That is a number, meaning it's quantitative. It's something we can count. It's objective. Nobody's going to disagree about one ruler being one ruler. Okay, but over here, the other property that we use to organize politics isn't quantitative. It's not objective in that sense. It's a value judgment. You have what he calls the correct or the deviant regimes. You could say like the good regimes and the perverse regimes. That's another translation. Okay, meaning the other property we look for is whether that government is, for Aristotle, trying to get the good uh, of the governed, like to serve the common good, or is the government trying to serve the self-interest of the ruler? So, if you're trying to serve the common good when you're a ruler, you fall under the correct type. If you're trying to serve your self-interest as a ruler, you fall under the deviant type. And so this is quantitative, it's a number, right? This is a value judgment. It's normative. But for these people in the past, that is it it could be in many ways the same as a number. You could be as confident about calling a regime good or bad as you could be about calling it one rule, like led by one ruler or led by, few rulers. So it breaks down into monarchy is rule of the one for the common good. Tyranny is rule of the one for self-interest. Few rulers for the common good are aristocrats, in some translations, republics, but that's a little tricky. Um, and if you're doing the negative version, if you're talking about few rulers ruling for their own self-interest, is oligarchy. Many rulers, the good version, and I don't think this translation's like too great. The good version would be like polity, uh, rule of the many for the good would be that. And then anarchy, honestly, the word that Aristotle uses is democracy, for the bad version, but it just means like he thinks of democracy as being like mobocracy. So this already tells us something really important about Machiavelli. And that's that Machiavelli is extremely sneaky and subversive. And that's part of what makes him interesting. He doesn't go out of his way to give a big speech or something about how, Aristotle did this and he thought that there's six regimes and he thought you can divide them not just by number, but by good or bad. But I question the goodness and badness as a value for politics. He doesn't do any of that. He just starts out by saying there's two kinds of regimes. He doesn't even engage with it. Okay. He says there's republics and principalities, and he drops the moral analysis of politics. That is very important. You need to keep an eye on that the whole time. He's not interested in whether a regime is trying to do good or bad. That to him is not political science. Okay, so the prince, of course, is going to focus on principalities, he tells us. And now let's talk about the types of principalities they are. Well, there's something called hereditary principalities, and those are easier to maintain. Um, there's continuity of rule, loyalty of subjects, and there's, I think you'd say, like, just your problems are going to be, in Machiavelli's opinion, they're going to be normal problems. Like, there's no special thing that you face. A hereditary principality is just like a prince whose dad dies and then he takes over, right? We know that there can be issues like maybe we're talking about like the Lion King and Mufasa dies and it should be Simba, but Scar takes over. And you have those kinds of problems in hereditary principalities, but like you're not going to have the kind of problem of like that the pride isn't gonna want Simba to rule when he starts ruling. They're gonna be used to him in some way. That, it wouldn't be the case if he showed up at another pride and was like, hey, I'm taking this over. Okay, that's a very out there experiment, but I'm trying to make a point about the benefit of hereditary rule basically being normalcy. It's easier to maintain because people want the continuity of the previous regime. And in one sense or another, they're going to be more loyal. Does anyone have anything to say about like what insights do you have about why a hereditary principality might be easier for Prince to hold? And I'll pause the recording so that you guys can I thought I was pausing the recording and I'm not pausing the recording. Pause the recording. Here we go. I paused the recording. Here's where things get tricky. Mixed principalities. He says these are the hardest to govern. A mixed principality for him, what that means is a place where you are the ruler, but it's a mixed principality because you come from a different place than the people you're ruling comes from. He's basically describing conquests here, that you're going to a place that you don't have any reason to be. Um, you're trying to expand your power. You're expanding your territory. You're acquiring more resources and land, but it's with people that they didn't choose you. Most of them probably didn't want you. You don't have any connection to them whatsoever. And these, he says, are the hardest to govern by far. Well, why? Let's talk about why. He says one big issue is that in order to come in and take over a place, you have to have had basically like cooperation from some portion of the society you're taking over. Someone that is already there has to have either cooperated to bring you there, or once that you get there, they have cooperated with you to hold it, like to enter the society and be seen as legitimate. That creates a problem that Machiavelli thinks you're going to see it all over the book is a major political problem to have, which is the problem of dependence. That now the people who helped bring you here to rule, they basically expect you to pay them back. Um, they don't do this out of the kindness of their hearts. They do it out of their self-interest. And so they're expecting repayment from you, and maybe they won't cooperate with you if you don't satisfy whatever repayment they expect. That's one problem. Another problem is whoever you had to cooperate with to get inside there is someone that you now know will overthrow their prince. So they're kind of suspicious to you. They're not going to be necessarily like you've kind of already seen what they're willing to do. And it would be foolish to think that they wouldn't do the same thing to you. Another problem is what he refers to as like mixed customs. You're coming to a place where the language may be different, the religion may be different, the clothing, the food, the habits can be different, the art can be different. All of these things will be really not what you're used to. And it's a big liability, he says, to be in a place that has such different culture and language from you and to not learn it, right? He says you basically have to be able to take on the manners that are already there. You have to be able to they don't have to become the only way that you act, but you have to become fluent in them, the way that you have to become fluent in their language, because otherwise it's going to be obvious to anybody just from a second or two of noticing things that you don't belong there. You're ruling it, but it's like someone from Mars coming and ruling like Texas State. It's obvious that that is an alien. And I don't know if you guys have ever watched the History Channel miniseries Vikings, but in the early parts of Vikings, there's a character called Rollo who is a real king, and they take over what uh is France. And he starts to like wear the court clothes, he starts to eat their food. He starts to do these different things, and in the end, it actually turns out to be a major part of his legitimacy is taking that stuff on. So when you're facing this kind of thing, Machiavelli says the basically what you've got to do is either you have to go there yourself and you have to live there, or you have to create colonies, meaning you have to send people from wherever you are, from like your original place. You have to send soldiers, you have to send politicians and even families and stuff there to have them live and to have them become acquainted and to be basically your presence and the beginning of some type of mixing. Um, this is in the middle of saying, well, you have to go live there. You have to learn how to talk like them. You have to send colonies, all things that sound normal to a political scientist like yourself. You're expecting stuff like that. Then he throws in there, you have to exterminate the the family line of the previous rulers. And this is another great Machiavelli moment that's teaching you something about how he thinks and how he writes. He names all this normal stuff to do from the perspective of like just statecraft and rule. And then he goes, "Oh, and actually you have to kill anybody who's related to the prince that you overthrew." And he means anybody. He means like even if they've got babies, you've got to kill their babies. He's dead serious because as long as those family lines, that bloodline still exists, there's a memory of the previous ruler that always puts you into the position of looking like a fake. And also, there's people who are going to say, well, I don't like this new ruler, or he didn't give me the tax break I wanted or the contract I wanted. And so I'm going to go find, the infant son of so and so. And I'm going to turn them into like the heir apparent that we're going to form an army around. So he names all these normal things about how to take over this kind of place and make it work out. But then he throws in there something that you're just like, if you really think about it, it's extremely cruel. Um, but it's not cruel for the sake of cruelty. It's cruel for the sake of power, which is a distinction we'll talk about later. Another solution is that if there are factions, which there always are, factions where you're taking over. Meaning if there's basically like political parties, we they don't have to be political parties, but something like that. Like these people in a society that live together, but they are really different from each other and they've formed groups and they have different goals and different ideas about what's good and good for them. That's what a faction is. And um he says when you take something over, there's factions in it. And so if there are factions that are kind of strong in the place that you take over, like if they've got some strength in them and some power, you have to do what you can to minimize that power because they're the ones who are the most likely to go and find someone to face off with you. Why? Because they can, right? They see you coming in and taking things over as a weak moment, and they're right. So it's a moment for them to strike. And you killed all the other families, right? Or all of the family members of the previous rulers. So what they can do is they'll just go and they'll get someone from somewhere else, like maybe another prince. And that happened in the time Machiavelli was alive. Um, and he talks about that in the book. So how do you weaken those strong parties to stop them from doing that? Well, you find out what parts of the factions in the society you're taking over are weaker, and you build them up. You basically use them as like a counterweight, and you put them in debt to you. Okay. Here is another kind, right? So we've talked about the hereditary principalities. We're talking about the mixed principalities, which he says are the ones that are the hardest. So we go easiest, hardest, and now we're here in what he calls entirely new states and conquered republics. He says uh, the sort of entirely new states, what is difficult there is that you'll have you decide how to rule based on if that is a centralized structure or if it's decentralized. If it's decentralized, it's a lot easier to take over, but it's harder to keep control of. And if it's centralized, it's really hard to take over, but it's easier to keep control of. If you're going to go in and you're going to conquer a republic, he says that that is almost impossible. Like you, so in this part is another moment of like, we talked in class about how there are times where there's like a seeming contradiction in the text and you should go and figure it out. Like it's a puzzle, go ferret it out, see what's going on. Well, up here, it seems mixed principalities are the hardest to govern. But then here he says the conquered republics are it sounds impossible. Well, how can both those things be true? The truth is that at least on the surface, what he's saying is that the mixed principality is manageable. There are things you can do to make it work out. But here with the conquered republic, he says the problem is that the people remember what it's like to be free. And it's very difficult to even keep this place if you take it over. He says you have to destroy it. Hold on one second. I'm gonna see if my dog is ready to come in, and then I'm gonna ask you a question about why it's hard to hold these kind of republics. Okay, so do you guys think Machiavelli's just like super sentimental? You think he's serious? Like when he says you can't hold a conquered republic because they love liberty, you think he's like, well, I'm not making fun of anyone. I'm not making fun of anyone. But like, kind of the thing that in my head always comes when I think of like sentimental love of freedom is that, and I'm proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free. You know, that song that came out when I was like, I remember hearing that when I was like 4. So it's really old, but nothing's really replaced it. And people will like cry when they hear this song. It is my whole life. I've seen people get so emotional about it. And there's a way of reading Machiavelli here. He says it's very difficult to hold a republic without destroying it because of their love of liberty. Um, you think he's being sincere? You think he's being like sentimental about the concept of liberty? Maybe another question would be, why would the love of liberty make it to where you'd almost have to destroy the republic to keep it? Okay, I'm gonna pause the recording.
Okay, so here I actually forgot to turn the recording back on for just a little bit and before moving on to the next question. And what we talked about was how when people get the taste of liberty and they know what it's like to be free, they don't want to return. It's like the cat's out of the bag. You know, sometimes you don't know how bad your life is, and then you get a chance for it to change. And it's a whole new world of opportunity for you, as one student said. And I think that's exactly right. So for Machiavelli, people who've gone through that, they will risk almost anything to keep it for different reasons. From there, we moved on to how he sets up the second part of the, the part of the book we're reading today, which gets into how to acquire places, which is kind of backwards because in the first part, we're talking about how to keep the places you acquire, and in this part, we're talking about how to acquire them in the first place. And so on the surface, it actually looks like he's dividing out four different strategies for acquiring power. And it turns out, for reasons that we get into, that reading those sections actually should be read less straightforwardly as an honest account of four different ways of gaining power and more about lessons about what he actually thinks power works like and what he always thinks should be avoided. So, for example, any situation where you're dependent on anyone is not going to work out. So, anytime he talks about using someone else's arms, that's not going to work. Anytime he talks about relying on another power to help you get power, like a foreign power or an internal power to get power, it's also not going to work. When you're reading that section, what we're really looking for is for lessons that emerge about what he thinks the truth about power and human nature is, even to the point where he's doing something really radical, and I kind of talk about the radicalness of his method of delivery of the message at all. So that's what that part is that we're about to get into now.
One's own arms for him is your soldiers. It can mean that. But it also means like so you having your own people to fight for you and not having to pay people to fight for you. He's very negative about mercenaries. He says they're not dependable. But one's own arms, I think, can also mean one's own ability and willingness to be violent and to fight. So there's two senses of what one's own arms means. It means have your own soldiers, don't get mercenaries, don't borrow like another king's soldiers either. Okay. Only have people fighting for you who are totally invested in your success because your success is their success too. But also one's own arms means one's willingness to be violent and to be cruel. Virtue means something we'll continue to talk about the whole time we're reading. Virtue is virtu, like the Italian. Translated, it is almost like manliness. It is virtue, but vir, is man in Latin. And in Italian, the word virtue really kept the meaning of masculinity with it. So virtue doesn't necessarily mean um, any of the ways that maybe the medieval period would talk about it or Plato would talk about it, like justice, moderation, holiness. For him, he's changing virtue to mean power of some kind. And it doesn't have to mean physical power, but you're going to see that virtue is a lot more power centered, manliness focused for him. Um, Obviously, through fortune or others' arms, he's making it sound like that's a legitimate way to acquire power. Well, we know from what we just talked about here that what one's our own arms means. Um, we know that actually he probably doesn't think you can acquire with someone else's arms. Um, so you should be like, scratch that. What is he really telling me here? Through wickedness. Another question we've seen up here, virtue for him means power. We learned in the earlier chapters that for him, doing these things that used to maybe have been called wicked, like exterminating children of the previous royal family, he doesn't use that language anymore. He's not thinking in the category of wicked or good. We saw that from the outset, right? When we talked about this, about his categories, there only being two and none of them having a moral component. Okay, so wickedness. Why is he even using the word wickedness? Whatever virtue is, it doesn't have the normal meaning of his predecessor culture. So here again, you should think, mm, scratch that out. Really, that's not really how he's thinking about this here. Um, through the support of citizens, similar. Everything you learned before up here. That's part of why I took so much time with it. There's this problem of dependence, of depending too much on the people when you come in and you take something over. It's a big enough issue that um, he basically tries to minimize the extent to which you're dependent on people when you come and take over a place and that you increase their dependence on you, right? And also, why does he not like arms that aren't your own? Because you can't depend on them. So here again, you should be thinking the support of citizens. He would he really make an entire way of acquiring a principality based on the support of citizens? No, he wouldn't. He doesn't think it's that reliable to depend on anyone, so he wouldn't do that. So again, what's the point? What's the useful thing here? And that is where we need to get to what he is really doing. And I'll get as far into it as I can with the time that we have, but um this is where it starts to flesh out more. And I labeled this part of the PowerPoint, which is on your module. I called it exemplars and insights because with Machiavelli, you find something that's true for Augustine, but less like not being, I mean, he's less tricky about it, I think. Both of them actually think the way that you learn anything about philosophy or about history is by studying what people have done. And so instead of doing this outline stuff, what Machiavelli's really more trying to get your attention to is look at the stories and examples I'm telling you and the lessons within those stories and examples that I'm pulling out. Um, this is one of the most important sort of notes to keep in mind for his entire method and how he thinks about politics too. With Machiavelli, there's a nice unity between his method and his politics. Try and move that out of the way so you can see this better. Uh, I don't want that way. I'm gonna put this here. There we go. Um, okay, check this out. So This goes all the way back to the second chapter of the book, where he talks about hereditary princes. He says, we have in Italy, for example, the Duke of Ferrara, who, for no other cause than that his line was ancient in that dominion, did not succumb to the attacks of the Venetians in 84, nor to those of Pope Julius in 10. For the natural experience has less cause and less necessity to offend. Um, let's see. And basically here that let me see. He says he will naturally have the goodwill of his own. So why was this Duke able to hold on against these really strong invasions from other places? And he says, well, because the people already thought he was a legitimate ruler. So, because the people there already thought he was a legitimate ruler because he was the heir, he had less cause and less necessity to offend, meaning he had less reason to piss off the people he's ruling because they already kind of don't have a problem with him, that he naturally has the goodwill of his own. From here, he moves to in antiquity and continuity, the dominion, the memories and causes of innovation are eliminated. For one always leaves a dentation for the building of another. And that's very vague. What does he mean? He says, in human life, in politics, or in how we think, even, we care about what we're used to. And so the strength of something being old is almost not whatever it is in itself, but the fact that it's already there, right? What do humans like? He says they like continuity. Okay. So what do they not like? He says they don't like innovation. However, he also says that when we're thinking about history, he compares it here to building a fence, right? And that if you look at that metaphor on the basic level, it sounds like he's saying something like things are best when things never change. That things are strongest when how they start and how they are now is the same. Think about when you build a fence and you want it to be like uniform. You keep making the bricks lay in the same way as they do in the beginning. It sounds very traditional. It sounds like an argument for tradition. Okay. It's not really, because what he says is that when you build a fence or a wall of this kind, what happens in a city, this is true of Italy at that time and most of the European cities, they would build their fences or their walls, and they knew that their city would keep growing and developing in ways that they couldn't imagine. So what they would do is they would leave what are called dentations. And dentations are like where you don't wrap up the wall. You left it for whoever's going to come later and who's going to have to keep building because you don't know what the future is going to look like and you don't know what the buildings are going to require. So you don't know where the fence is going to go. You leave these little spaces for someone to come and to put their blocks in a way that fits for what they need to do. That's called a dentation. And so in Italy, in Florence especially, there will be times where you'll see a fence and then you'll see it basically morph into another type of brick or maybe another style of brick or another quality of brick, and it will tend into a new direction. So from the outsider's perspective, if you're not thinking really hard, it just looks like a brick. It just looks like a fence. It looks like very traditional. But if you're paying close attention, you see that actually what's happened is some kind of fusion, some kind of change, and that the virtue of it, or the smartness of it, the gift of it, is that they've managed to make something new, um, that can fit the needs of a new time, um, without making it look new, without calling attention to the changes of it. And so aesthetically, it fits in, and humans walk around in it and they're not thinking, wow, I live in this freakishly designed discordant place. They don't even tell that it's changed. And here you see that what Machiavelli thinks is that when it's possible that even for the hereditary prince, but for all people who engage in politics, that it's in their interest to understand that humans like for things to be stable. Humans like for things to be what they're used to. Even the words, they want the words to be what they're used to. And so he's also saying things do have to change, just because life goes on. Or it doesn't even have to be a bad reason that stuff has to change, but that change is a part of history and life. Well, what you have to do to be a ruler who can ride that wave of change is uh, you have to alter things to keep power and to keep things running, but you have to do it in a way that fits in with how people already think. You don't want them to think you're doing something new. You don't want them to think that you're threatening what is stable. You have to keep the language and appearances of the previous. And it doesn't even seem to think he really faults people for wanting that. And the reason it's so important that this is at the beginning of the prince is that A, it tells you something really important about how he sees politics and being smart about politics, right? Um, Whatever being smart about politics means for him is going to mean a lot of that subtlety that you see in this whole discussion here. Um, But the other thing it's telling you is more important, and it's that he's doing something in this book that is completely different than what has come before. But he's going to keep the language of the past, and he's going to keep the examples of the past, and he's going to say things in a way that the people of his time expect him to say them. He's not going to call attention to the major changes he's making. He's going to make the changes he's making, which are so radical, seem to be invisible, right? It's seamless work. So then we realize that in what seems like a pretty tame kind of beginning of a book, that kind of seems to be a little outliney, a little category driven. We're actually dealing with something that is much more striking. He's actually in the course of the book not just going to talk about a new type of politics, he's also going to talk about a new type of account of human nature. Um, that his politics is built on. Okay. So I'll go ahead and start with this one just because it's the easiest one for us to do before we pick up for next time. Here's probably the best example of that. By the time you get into this section here, which is 8 and 9, you start to see this concept called using cruelty well, using cruelty all at one stroke, all at once. This is a great example of the kind of thing I'm talking to you about the subtle changes he's undertaking. There's never been a philosopher who here, like what he's doing, he's not he's not interested in saying whether or not cruelty is justified or whether it's good or bad. In fact, he's just asserting that cruelty is a part of politics. He's not going to get into whether it's virtuous or not. Um, Cruelty is a part of how you keep power. And you know that because you've seen now that he's been willing to exterminate family lines and he's been willing to possibly, maybe genocide entire places if the people are too used to living free and you want their land. So he uses cruelty. But what is the thing he's doing that is really interesting and new is instead of spending a bunch of time talking about whether cruelty is good or bad, he's going to talk about whether cruelty is effective or not. Okay, he says we want to use cruelty well. Cruelty is bad. It's a problem when you are using it basically indiscriminately. You're not using it effectively and you're having to do it over and over again. You're having to do cruel things again and again and again. That's when it's bad to be cruel. When you're using cruelty well, you're using it all at one stroke. Well, what does that mean? It means you're using it in basically the most efficient way possible. And the example here that's really important is Romero de Orco. Oh, Romero de Orco. So if you played Assassin's Creed, there's like an entire version of that game that has Machiavelli, and Romero de Orco is a character in it. Um, and he's talking about Machiavelli's talking about how this great prince, this duke, is taking over an area. He's taking over Romagna, and Romagna, they don't want him to be there. So he sends over this man named Romero de Orco. His name is actually Don Romero de Loca, but he didn't write that down. Once the Duke had taken over Romagna, he found it had been commanded by impotent lords who had been readier to despoil their subjects than to correct them, and had given their subjects matter for disunion, not for union. Since that province was quite full of robberies, quarrels, and every other kind of insolence, he judged it necessary to give it good government if he wanted to reduce it to peace and obedience to a kingly arm. So he put there Messer Romero de Orco, a cruel and ready man, to whom he gave the fullest power. In a short time, Romero reduced it to peace and unity with the very greatest reputation for himself. Why? Because he was like a psycho and he was killing everybody, Romero was. Then the Duke judged that such excessive authority was not necessary because he feared that it might become hateful. Okay, so he got the violence out of the Orco that he wanted Now it's getting to the point where instead of being scared of him, the people of Romagna are going to say, we've had enough. We're going to kill this guy. And then we're going to get rid of the Duke. Okay. So the Duke judged that such excessive authority was not necessary because he feared that it might become hateful, and he set up a civil court in the middle of the province with a most excellent precedent where each city had its advocate. Because he knew that past rigors had generated some hatred for Ramiro, like because he knew Ramiro was out of control. To purge the spirits of that people and to gain them entirely to himself, he wished to show that if any cruelty had been committed, this has not come from him, but from the nature of his minister. Now, having seized this opportunity, he had him placed one morning in the piazza at Cesena in two pieces, with a piece of wood and a bloody knife beside him. The ferocity of the spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. So the Duke always knew he was going to kill Ramiro de Orco, but he needed him to be cruel because he needed to subdue the population. He also always knew that he was going to kill him. He was going to kill Ramiro, and he was going to use him as an example. Uh, he's going to come in and look like the savior. Like, look, I killed this terrible person because I care about you. I want to protect you from cruelty. And look what will happen to the people that are bad to you. I will protect you from them. And also, if you do something that pisses me off, I'll do this to you too. That's cruelty well used. Okay, that's probably the best example of cruelty well used. He doesn't think cruelty is bad. He thinks it's very effective. He thinks it's bad when you don't know how to use it. Okay. You guys are doing so great. Um, you're doing really good. I will uh put up uh new questions for you, actually probably just like one or two. Not a lot. And you can just physically turn in your questions to me, okay? When I see you on Wednesday, you can turn in the ones from today. Thank you again. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
I
Bye. See you guys later. Great day.